especially listening. Listening, I found with students is, they could read and study grammar, but
Yeah.
listening to actual people talk, they get
Yeah.
stumped up. I have a student who just asked me to teach her that is dealing with
But
that.
it's a real cognitive process. It's a very complex task, and it depends what you're listening for. So a lot of people, when they think of listening, they're not thinking about listening to conversations, but they're thinking about listening tests. Listening tests ask you to do very specific things. So you'll listen to a passage. You're supposed to get a general idea about what happened, and then there may be some specific language points, or you might get those kind of true, false, not given type questions. And actually, that kind of listening is very difficult, even for native speakers of the language. I mean, I have trouble getting those questions right if I listen to those kind of tests. So listening for tests and listening to conversation are two very different things. Listening to conversation, at a lower level, it's not really, I think what people get hung up on is that they come to a passage that they don't understand, or maybe there's a sentence where they're not sure about every single word in the sentence, and then at that point they've kind of reached the limit of what they can understand, and then the panic starts to set in, and then at that point you've lost them. So it's more about training people to not attempt to try to process and understand everything, but just try and get a general sense about what it is that's been said, because you can figure out what the message is without necessarily understanding what all the words are. And then there's a lot of negotiation for meaning that can happen during listening as well. If you're in an actual conversation with someone, and you want to express that you don't really understand what was said, I mean, there are all kinds of little cues that will go off between you as the listener and the person who's doing the speaking in actual conversation. If you can see each other,
Yeah.
there'll be facial cues, there'll be hand signals, that just like that.
Yeah.
And if you can't see each other, there'll be pauses, there'll be hesitations, there'll be things that are happening during that dialogue where it's signaling to somebody that they don't understand. I mean, even a pause of, like, say 3 seconds in response to a question in a normal conversation, that would be very unnatural. So then somebody will, at that point, if there is a pause, the other speaker will try and repair that. So one thing to do is to listen to actual conversations, people, because if you're just relying on like tape scripts and recorded audio that is written to be spoken, then what you don't get is that real kind of interaction of what happens in a real conversation, where people are trying their absolute best to get these messages across. And there's a number of strategies within that are very important, that can be taught. These kind of conversational repair strategies, for example, that can be really useful for second language learners, even at a very low level, because they can employ these strategies then to repair the conversation and to keep things going. And part of that is listening as well as speaking.
Yeah, and asking questions.
Yeah, I mean, questions, it's also the kind of questions. I mean, a question can be like, or it can be, did you say, or could you repeat that? Or maybe you try to paraphrase the sentence that they just said, and then see if that makes sense when you play it back in a way. There's lots of different things that, if you study lots of interaction between people, and maybe have that in the form of a video with an accompanying script, and if the script has details that show some of the extra linguistic things that are going on, like the pauses or the gestures and things like that. By studying that very rich data, you can get an idea about what's actually happening when people communicate. And people know how to do this in their first language, but when it comes to the second language, they may not understand the different cues that, say, a native English speaker would use, or the different kind of repair strategies, because these things work differently across cultures.
Would having a script of a conversation or of a listening be valuable in a classroom, like for a class exercise, or is that a little too much?
It depends on the nature of the class. So if you're with a class of children, that would never work.
Sure.
If you're with a group of adults who are at a reasonably, say, intermediate level of proficiency, and they want to study some specific repair strategies or ways to keep the conversation going, then yeah, by all means, I think that would be a good idea. To actually, I mean, very often what happens is, and this is one of the amusing things when you think about it, is that a lot of people end up going to English conversation classes, right? But all they do is they just talk during the class. And that's the conversation class. But what I try to do sometimes, and this is going back 10 years, even in my kind of last few years in Korea, I was trying to do this, is that we'd actually study a conversation.
How would you study a conversation?
Well, one of the things I did was I actually used Simpsons episodes. And I mean, these are not real conversations, but I would have the video and the script. And then I would play the video. I'd get people to go down the script and mark out things they weren't sure about. And then we try to give them some explanation. And then we try to get them to reconstruct that in their own words, if they weren't comfortable using the words from the script. So they figure out what the dialogue was actually about, what the different sides were trying to do in that dialogue, and try to reconstruct that themselves. So the language itself was treated more like an objective study, like we actually studied it instead of just chatting to each other. So when you think about a conversation class, sometimes the actual studying the language on paper it can be a useful exercise. I wouldn't recommend it for all types of learners, but certainly I find that you reach a stage, usually at intermediate level, where you've done pretty much all you can with your basic approach to language learning. But then to get to the advanced level, you need to actually study a little bit.
You need to put in some hard work there, right?
And it's not just a case of practice makes perfect, because you can practice for the rest of your life and never be perfect. Whether you ever want to be perfect or not is a story for another time. But then at least I find that sometimes you actually have to study the language, and if you want to learn how to have a conversation, study how to have a conversation, like study the strategies that are involved and the different processes that are involved in that. And a lot of that is culture specific, and a lot of it is language specific as well. And it's very useful to teach even lower level learners some of these strategies, so that they don't just freeze like a deer in headlights whenever they get into a conversation with a native speaker and the conversation suddenly goes on to something that they hadn't memorized. And
I might even argue it might be more important for lower level students to start, and for teachers of lower level classes to start having more genuine, authentic material practice in lower level classes, so they don't get these fossilized errors. Hey guys, I'm sitting here with my daughter, Sophia. She's recording this, and I just want to thank you for watching this video. If you like it and you want to see another video like it, then right next to me, you can click another video for a fun lesson idea or a teaching tip. And don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you get new videos every week. Keep teaching and keep learning. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.